Okay, tonight, for those who have the book, we're doing chapter 19, just one chapter tonight, because there's so much in it. And the subject is when you change the punctuation in a verse. In other words, there's we'll call it the simple, literal, usual way to read a verse in the Torah. And then if you change the punctuation, meaning usually you put as it were the comma in a different place or a semicolon in a different place, you can get a whole other meaning. This is one of the methods that the sages, the rabbis, later Kabbalists and Hasidic masters used extensively by reading a verse differently, but they did it by changing the punctuation. So as always, we only bring a number of examples, but like every method, there's usually scores, hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of examples that we could bring. So tonight we're going to do a number of examples of changing the punctuation. So the first one, for those who are following, is on page 178. And it's the third verse in the Torah. Just one second here. And that is that Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or, Vayehi Or. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. So it's pretty straightforward. But when we realize this is a Torah that I saw in the Netivat Shalom, the Slonomer Rabbi. If you look at the previous verse, meaning the second verse in the Torah, it says, V'ha'aretz hayta tohu v'ohu, the earth was chaotic and void, v'choshech al pnei hatahom, and darkness was on the abyss, the tahom. V'ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim, and the Spirit of God moved across the waters. So here we see that before there was light, there was darkness, chaos, and void. So the Slonomer Rebbe reads it like this. He reads it on a personal level. This is actually one of the most important concepts and principles of all Hasidic works, is we have to make everything in the Torah personal. We have to see it relevant to our own lives today. So many times different aspects of the Torah are, in a sense, it seemed that they're happening a long time ago or applied to situations that might not necessarily seem so relevant. Hasidus comes and makes it relevant. So the Slonomer Rebbe reads the third verse about the creation of light in relationship that first there was darkness. So he reads it like this: when a person is in a state of darkness or worry, a chaos and void, unsettled, and there's darkness all around. So instead of reading the verse, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So the Netivat Shalom, just by changing the punctuation and putting a couple of brackets in there, reads it like this: Vayomer. Now, usually we read it Vayomer Elokim, and God said, but he puts a comma right after he said, but it's out in the Hebrew, it's after Vayomer. So a person says, Elokim, God. let there be light. I'm surrounded by darkness. I'm surrounded by worry and unsurety. Let there be light. And there was light. And God creates light for the person. It's just a beautiful reading of the verse. I'll do it again just so make sure everyone understands it. Instead of, and God said, let there be light, it's a person who is in a state of darkness is calling out to God. Vayomer, a person says, God, let there be light. I'm surrounded by darkness. Help me out here. And there was light. So that changes the entire meaning of it. Of course, it's connected to the simple literal text of God creating light, but here it's the person who's crying out to God to create light, and there was light. So that's our first example with just really changing the comma. I see Bracha has her hand up. If at all possible, we try to hold the questions to the end. Is that okay, Bracha? Okay. Okay. I'm just afraid of getting off on tangents and everything, but we'll get to you at the end, okay? Okay, that's our first example. The next one is on page 179. Starting at the bottom of 179, it goes on to 180. This is a very, very profound one, and one of the main examples of changing the punctuation. So the background of the story is after the brothers sell Yosef, it was really, Yosef was in the pit. Shimon and Levi were, God forbid, ready to kill him. And Reuben is trying to save him. But Yehuda comes and says, let's not shed the blood of our brother, let's sell him. And Yehuda was the natural leader of the brothers. And because Yehuda said that, they in fact sold Yosef. But then after it happened, they all immediately realized like what a mistake they had made. But because it was Yehuda's advice to sell him, Yehuda felt like an outcast. He went away from the brothers. He married. He had 3 sons, and his 2 of his sons, his first son married Tamar, and he died. And then the second son married Tamar in a Levirate marriage, and he died also. And now it was the third son was still young. And so Yehuda said to her, wait for the third son. But because 2 of his sons had already died, married to this woman, he wasn't so ready to give his third son either. And so a number of years passed by, and the third son is certainly old enough now. And another marriage is not being set up. Back then, a Levirate marriage was very common. So Tamar, who was fueled by a prophecy, she had a prophetic calling that from her and one of the sons of Yehuda would come a kingly energy into the world. And so, as the story is told in the Torah, it's not a midrash, it's in the Torah, she dressed up and covered her face and appeared as a prostitute. And Yehuda ended up sleeping with her. And then she disappears. And 3 months later, everyone notices that she's pregnant. And so Yehuda, his first reaction is she should be punished for this. And she sent a note before she would be together with him. She asked for some kind of a surety, in Hebrew, a pikadon. And so he left his staff and a signet with her. And so she sent back to him and said, by the one who owns these, that's who I'm pregnant by. So Yehuda obviously recognized. Now, this was a classic example. He could have said nothing, and she would have been killed. He took what's called the higher road, and he publicly admitted it. And in the Torah, all of this is to get to here. He says, Tzadka mimeni. She is more righteous than me. Many people comment that this is the first person in the Torah to do tshuva. And not only that, but publicly admit a mistake and take responsibility for it. Now remember, Yehuda is the great grandfather of David HaMelech. So from him actually comes the line of Mashiach. And some people put it together because he said, again, he did tshuva and he admitted it and he did it publicly, that this was such an incredible energy that it created the energy for the messianic line. And we learned that she gave birth and she had twins. And from one of her sons, from Peretz, comes the line of David HaMelech, from King David. And you see that in the last two verses of the book of Ruth, where the lineage of King David is given, and it goes back to Yehuda and Tamar. Now, here's where we get to the change in punctuation. He says, Tzadka mimeni. She is more righteous than me. Rashi comes and explains there's a tradition that you divide these two words. You put like a dash between them. He said, Tzadka, she is righteous. And a voice came from heaven and said, Mimeni. This whole thing is from me, from God. So here you're reading it completely different. Instead of him saying both words, she is more righteous than me, here he says the first word, she is more righteous, and God sends a heavenly voice to say, from me. This whole thing is from me. Now, this is an incredibly profound idea. If we had the full hour just to talk about the ramifications of what it means that God comes and says, this whole thing is for me. I arranged this whole thing. I set this whole thing up. Then you get into the whole thing of divine providence and free will. And it gets quite deep here. But here we see, again, with just a slight change in the punctuation, where we get a whole different meaning. I will bring one midrash that's connected to this. And it's all of this is happening in Parshat Vayeshev, in the book of Genesis. And and so there's a midrash that says, like, what's happening to the family of Yaakov? So it says Yaakov is sitting in sackcloth and ash, mourning for Yosef. The brothers are sitting in sackcloth and ash, because Yaakov doesn't know this, but they know that they're responsible for this, and they're already doing tshuva. Yehuda goes off, and he like in personal exile. And the Midrash says, and what is God doing this whole time? And the Midrash says God is arranging for the Mashiach to come. In other words, this is connected to God saying, Mimeni. This whole thing is from me. And that's what the Midrash says, that God is arranging for the light of Mashiach. So again, we could bring many, many other examples from the Torah, from the sages, where you have this concept that what appears to be a result of people's free will, that, I mean, Tamar took the initiative here. Yehuda did what he did. The brothers did what they did by selling Yosef in the first place. And God is somewhere behind the scenes here, somehow, right, pulling the strings. So then you enter into deep paradox of how does free will and taking responsibility for one's actions dovetail with divine providence. I'm going to leave it here though, but here is like a classic example where just a slight change of the punctuation reveals a whole other part of the story. Okay, now we're going to go to two Torahs. One is on page 180 and the other on page 185. They're very similar, so I'm going to bring them together. And this one is, it's the bottom of 180. I'll just read in English what the verse is. Now this has to do with making the Mishkan, making the tabernacle. So it says, God spoke to Moshe saying, speak to Aharon and say to him, when you light the lamps, the 7 lamps shall cast their light towards the face of the menorah. Aaron did so. He lit the lamps towards the face of the menorah as God had commanded Moshe. Okay, it seems pretty straightforward that God commanded Moshe to tell Aaron how to light the menorah. And you'll see it italicized, Aaron did so. Aaron did what he was told. So Rashi comes and he says 2 words. What does it mean that he did what he was told? So Rashi says, Shelo Shina. He did not change. Just 2 words. Shelo Shina, meaning he didn't change his actions from the instructions that he was given. He was given instructions how to light the menorah, and he did so without changing anything in it. Now, I have to share that many times Reb Shlomo was here on the Moshav on this parsha. And sometimes, and I'm not exaggerating, he would spend almost the entire Shabbos talking about these 2 words of Rashi and all of the ramifications, Shelo Shina, that he didn't change. And he used it to discuss the whole idea of change, when we should change, when we shouldn't change, what's natural about us, what should we keep, what should we fix. And he would just go on and on about these 2 words. So one of the explanations is that we can read it differently, again, by putting a comma or a dash between these 2 words. You could read it Shelo comma, shina. That, and I believe we learned this last week. We did, for those who were here. Last week we were learning about the cantillations, the musical notes of the Torah. And one of them is called the shalshelet. And it's only 4 times, right? Susan, I see you going like this. The one that it only appears 4 times sounds like one of the times is Aaron on the dedication, the week before the dedication, and the different sacrifices that are brought to inaugurate and sanctify the Kohanim. And they have this note because Aaron was so unsure that he was worthy to be the high priest after his part in the golden calf. So, so to understand Shelo Shina is because he had such angst, such existential angst, you might think that he wouldn't do exactly as he's told, not on purpose, but that he wasn't focused. He was like blaming himself. And so the simple meaning is Rashi comes to say when the text says Aaron did so, it means he regained his composure and he's able to do the avoda in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Mishkan. He's taken it upon himself and now he's able to do it. That's the simple literal meaning. But if you put a comma between Shelo and Shina, you could read it that the voice saying lo means no. The voice saying no in Aaron's head, Shina, he changed. He was able to change his unsurety, his self-doubt, his even you could say lack of self-esteem, and he was able to change that the shelo, the part of him, the negative voice in his head, shina, he was able to change. But again, we only can read that by changing the punctuation of these 2 words of Rashi. So now we go to page 185 and we find a similar story, and this is of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was not raised in the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement was brand new. And he lived in the time of the successor of the Baal Shem Tov. I mean, he was born when the Baal Shem Tov was still alive. But the Maggid of Mezrich had taken over for the Baal Shem Tov. And the Alter Rebbe was already considered a genius, and he was part of the whole Latvia yeshiva movement. But at a certain point, he decided to go to the Maggid of Mezrich just to see what he had to teach. And he went to the Maggid, and the Hasidic movement was very, very new to him. And part of him was very drawn to it, and part of him was not sure, was resisting like changing his whole philosophical view of the world. And so one time the Maggid called him in, and there's a pasuk, it's in Vayikra, you see it's 6:5. And in English, it's talking about the altar, and that there should be a perpetual fire shall remain a flame on the altar. It shall not be extinguished. So this is actually a mitzvah in the Torah that they kept. It's actually an amazing thing This is an outside altar, meaning it was exposed to all the elements, to wind, rain, snow. And they kept this fire going uninterrupted for hundreds of years. Because the mitzvah was you could not let this fire go out. And so part of the avoda of the Kohanim was to keep this fire going. So where it says, Eish tamid tukad al mizbeach lo tichbeh. Do not put it out. Lo tichbeh. Do not put it out. So the Magi calls the Alter Rebbe in, and he reads this pasuk to him 10 times. 10 times in a row. But he changed the nuance. And he read it like this, that there should be a continual fire on the altar. He was talking to the Alter Rebbe. He said, the voice in your head that's saying, no, Hasidus is not for me, tichbeh, put it out. Put it out. So which is the opposite meaning of don't put out the fire. But the Magi was saying, this voice in your head that is saying, no, tichbeh, put it out. So you see why I brought these two Torahs together of Aaron and the Alter Rebbe, because they're very, very similar. They're different verses. But again, by changing just a little comma between two words, the Magi changed the meaning altogether. For those who don't know, the Alter Rebbe became one of the greatest students of the Magi, maybe the greatest. And everything followed, but like the story is that this was the turning point. The turning point was the Magi was saying, I know what's going on in your head. Put out that negative. You're meant to adopt the Hasidic philosophy. And of course, the Alter Rebbe went on to create the Chabad movement, Lubavitch. Okay. Now the next one, I love this one personally on page 181, right in the middle here. So it's Parshat Ekev. Parshat Ekev in the book of Deuteronomy has some of the most beautiful descriptions of Eretz Yisrael. And we know that in most cases, the Torah is very, very, doesn't waste any words. And so it's only, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 verses, but they're just so beautiful, and they describe Eretz Yisrael so perfectly. So one of them is that it says that in the land, lo techsar kolba, you will not lack anything. In other words, everything you want is there. Lo techsar kolba, nothing will be lacking from you. Again, if you change the punctuation, here there are 4 words. We're going to change the comma to be after the second word. So you could read it, lo techsar, you won't lack, kol ba, everything is in it. See, the first way you read it is there'll be nothing, it's not in the negative, but it's like more than negative. You won't be lacking anything. But the way you read this is you won't be lacking. Why? Kol ba, everything is in it. So here I write the way we can see Eretz Yisrael. First of all, Eretz Yisrael is incredibly small. It's the size of, in square miles, whatever, of New Jersey, the whole thing. But in this little place, you have a snow-capped mountain. You have snow-capped mountains. You have deserts. You have lakes. You have forests. You have the lowest place on the face of the earth. You have the largest natural crater in the world in Mitzpeh Ramon. If anyone's been in Mitzpeh Ramon, sometimes it's called the Grand Canyon of Israel. Absolutely spectacular. And you have the Mediterranean, you have the sea. Many countries are landlocked. So here in such a little country, you have almost every kind of topography in a very small place, very, very small place. So that's the idea of kolba. And it's all, in a sense, in miniature. It's all in miniature. But the way I relate to this is that Baruch Hashem, and I'm sure many of you also have been able to travel and see the world. And there are absolutely beautiful places, awe-inspiring places, inspiring places everywhere in nature. It's God's handiwork. We say in the morning, Ein sur ke'Elokeinu. There's no rock like our God. And so the sages read it, don't read it sur, rock, read it sayar, artist, painter. There's no painter like our God. There's no artist like our God. You look at the natural world and it's like, it's God's handiwork. And so I'm not sure if Susan is the only one from Denver, but I lived in Denver for 7 years, and we would go to the Rocky Mountains as often as we could. The Rocky Mountains are just magnificent. We just absolutely just loved it. So just in general, so what's the difference between all of these awe-inspiring places in the world and Eretz Yisrael, which has, I think is it Michigan or Minnesota? It's called the land of 10,000 lakes. It's one of them. It's on their license plate. It's either Minnesota or Michigan. It's called the state of 10,000 lakes. Israel has 2. Some people come and they look, if they see the Jordan River, they're expecting, oh, it's Minnesota. Okay. I remember once, Minnesota, Minneapolis is a hub city. So I can't remember what airlines, but I used to take it a lot, and you used to fly in just around the city of Minneapolis. It was unbelievable. You're flying in and there's hundreds of lakes everywhere. But you know what, in my experience, the difference is Eretz Yisrael is mine. All these other places are not mine. I can see them and enjoy them and be inspired by them and love them. But in Eretz Yisrael, it's mine. It's my mountain. It's my desert. It's my Yam Kinneret. And that makes, I'm sure many of you have been to Eretz Yisrael, know what I'm talking about. It's a different relationship with the land. So that's why I love this Torah. Kolba, everything is in it. Everything is in it. Okay. Now we have one more. And this is a bit involved. I just have to read this. Annie says there's over 250,000 lakes in Ontario. 250,000 lakes in Ontario. That's great. But those who have been to Eretz Yisrael, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. When you stand in certain places in Eretz Yisrael, the love affair is because it's yours, it's your land, it's our land. And the relationship is very different. I think I've told this before, but it just popped into my head. One time in the little forest behind our Beit Knesset, so Reb Shlomo was talking to one of the mothers who was playing with her child. And he said, your daughter is so beautiful, is so special. And the mother responded naturally, nothing wrong with it. She said, all children are beautiful and special. And I'll never forget this. I just happened to be standing there. Reb Shlomo looked at her like in a very deep way and said, but your child to you has to be the most beautiful and the most special. And I can't forget the way he said that, because that's what I'm trying to express here. The whole world is beautiful, no doubt about it, no doubt about it. But this land is ours, so it has to be in our mind more special and more beautiful. Okay, so this last one, this actually, for those of you who have Orchard of Delights, I think I probably edited it, but it's from Parshat Ha'azinu in Orchard of Delights. And this is one of the verses of the song of Ha'azinu is, God alone leads them, and there is no foreign God with him. God alone leads them. There's no foreign God with him. Just 1 second. Oh. So I want to read it in the Hebrew, make sure I get it right. So it says, Hashem badad yanchenu. God alone leads them. Ve'ein imo el nechar. And there is not with him any strange God. So here we're going to comment on Hashem badad yanchenu. Hashem alone leads them. Now, I have to say that I didn't see this. This is my own innovative idea here. If you put the comma after the word alone, you can read it very, very different. Hashem badad, comma, yanchenu. Hashem is alone. He leads them, which is very different than he alone leads them. Hashem is alone. He leads them. So why do I feel that this is significant? Is because in Devarim 33:28, it says something similar about Israel. So it says like this. Vayishkon Yisrael betach badad ein Yaakov el Eretz Dagan v'tirosh. But what I'm interested in is the first part. It says, and Israel will dwell securely alone. Badad, same word, badad. So here we have this idea of God being called alone and Israel dwelling alone. But in the so-called curses of Bilam, so he tries to curse Israel by saying that they will dwell alone. I'm going to find that verse also. It's in Bamidbar in Numbers 23:9. This is one of the ways that Bilam is trying to curse Israel. One second. Oh, 29. Okay. So he said, this is what Bilam says. He says, Hen am levadad yishkon, ubagoyim lo yitchashev. They will be a nation that dwells alone. Among the nations, they will not be considered. Now, if you read the papers the last 70 years, how many times has this applied to the United Nations? Where it's as if Israel is not counted among the nations. This is exactly what Bilam he was trying to curse them, saying they will dwell alone. And then lastly, in going back to Devarim, I'm bringing all of the sources at once, in 33:28. This one I read already, that Israel will dwell securely alone. Okay, so how do we put this all together? So this is a very, very deep understanding of the existential reality of a human being. Because when it says God is alone, it's very, very similar to when we say the Shema. We say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, God, our God, God is one. In the last few years, the Art Scroll changed God is one to, I believe, God is unique. In other words, God's aloneness is unique. The being of God is, there's nothing that compares with it. So why are we comparing the aloneness of God, not loneliness of God? That's something else. When we say aloneness, means the uniqueness of God with Israel. In the story of Bereshit, so it says that God blew into the nostrils Nishmat Chayim, the soul of life. And man became a Nefesh Chaya, a living soul. And so the Zohar explained, what does it mean that God blew into his nostrils? So the Zohar explains that when a person blows a shofar, a balloon, whatever it is, they blow from their innards. If anyone's blowing a shofar or blowing just a balloon, you have to take from your inner gut and blow into it. And we're told that's where the soul comes from. The soul comes from as it were, the innards of God. So the idea that God is one relates to every individual. Every single individual shares this aloneness, this uniqueness, this oneness. And even though human beings are social by nature. I mean, you have hermits, they do exist, but 99.99.99% of human beings have a need to be in social contract. Friends, family, spouse, children, whatever it is, community. It's a tremendous need in a human being. And yet we are all individuals. And that's what it says in Pirkei Avot, that a person is born against their will, they die against their will, and will be judged against their will. We are born alone, even if you're twins or triplets, still each person 24/7 is a self-contained world. That's what we're told, that if someone, God forbid, murders someone, it's as if they destroyed an entire world. And so we share this with God. This is a very, very deep understanding of the point of godliness within ourselves, shares this idea of badad, of uniqueness. Again, when we say the word aloneness, we're not talking about loneliness. We're talking about uniqueness and a separate entity. So this is just a very, very deep understanding of who we are as creatures, that we share something profoundly deep with our Creator. And this is also in Hasidut, the idea is that the soul being a chalak eloka mima'al mamash, an actual part of God above. Or what it says in Hazinu, the same, actually just a few verses between Hashem Yechenu, but Hashem Badad Yechenu, that God alone, comma, leads them. It says Chalak Hashem Amo, a part of God is his people. And it could be read that the Jewish people are God's representatives. They're his portion in this world. They're his representatives. But almost more literally, is a part of God is his people, which is saying that the soul is a chalak eloka mima'al mamash, an actual part of God above. So later, I just want to add that in Zechariah, so he actually, Rashi quotes him. Zechariah says that in the future, this is a very, very famous verse, that each person in Israel will dwell safely under their fig tree and their vine. And Rashi explains, what does that mean? I mean, it sounds beautiful. It means like it'll be like a paradise. Everyone will dwell securely beneath their fig tree and the vine. But Rashi explains it a little bit different. He says that it's all talking about the Messianic era, that it'll be a time where there'll be no war, and people don't have to come together to defend themselves from an enemy. Each person can dwell securely under their fig tree and the vine, but alone. In other words, there'll be no need for armies. There'll be no need for people to come together. Every person, every individual can dwell under their fig tree and their vine. So actually, when we moved into our house in the Moshav, on the whole hill where all of the houses were built, there was one tree, quite literally, actually, mamish literally, one tree. And for those who have been to my house, it was growing out of a cave that I have right in front of my front door. Not everyone has a cave by their front door, but there was this big, huge fig tree. And so right by our front door, we planted a grapevine. So we could fulfill this verse that every time we walked into our house, we were walking under our fig tree and our vine. So this is a good blessing to end with, that I want to bless all of Israel for the time where we will not need armies. We will all be able to live under our fig tree and our vine. And of course, that includes everyone coming back to Eretz Yisrael, and that everyone should have the merit to live under their fig tree and their vine.